There is a story most people never hear about Abraham Lincoln. Not the one about the Gettysburg Address, not the one about the abolition of slavery, but a quieter story, one that took place in a small law office in Springfield, Illinois, sometime in the 1850s. A client came to Lincoln furious, wanting to file a lawsuit immediately. He had been wronged, he said, cheated. He wanted justice, and he wanted it now. Lincoln listened. He listened for a long time, and then he said something that the man did not expect. He told him to wait, not forever, not passively, but deliberately, strategically. He told him that the situation, if left alone for a certain period, would resolve itself more completely than any court ever could. The client was frustrated. He left unconvinced. But Lincoln was right. He almost always was, not because he was smarter than everyone in the room, but because he had learned something that very few people ever truly learn. That waiting, done with intention and clarity, is not the absence of action. It is the most precise form of action available to a human being. Most of us have been taught from a very early age that patience is a moral quality, a virtue, something the good and disciplined possess and the weak and impulsive lack. We praise patient people the way we praise people who are generous or kind, as if patience were simply a matter of character, something you either have or you don't. But this framing, however common, misses something fundamental. It treats patience as a static quality, a kind of noble suffering, a waiting room experience dressed up in philosophical clothing. And that misunderstanding, subtle as it is, changes everything about how we relate to time, to effort, and to the results we spend our lives chasing. What history actually shows, when you look closely enough, is something far more interesting. The people who shaped the world, the generals, the artists, the builders, the reformers, were not, in most cases, the ones who pushed hardest or moved fastest. They were the ones who understood timing in a way that bordered on instinct. They knew when to act and, crucially, when not to. And the when not to was never passive. It was never resignation. It was a calculated, sometimes agonizing, always deliberate choice to let time do the work that effort alone could not. This distinction between patience as endurance and patience as strategy is not merely philosophical. It has consequences, real, measurable, historical consequences. And understanding it might be the most underrated skill a person can develop in the course of a lifetime. To understand where this idea begins, it helps to go back roughly 25 centuries. In the 5th century BCE, somewhere in the state of Chu in ancient China, a philosopher whose name may have been Li Er, known to history as Lao Tzu, the Old Master, composed a short text of 81 verses. The text was called the Tao Te Ching, which translates loosely as the Book of the Way and its Power. It is one of the most translated documents in human history, second only to the Bible, and one of the most consistently misread. Most people encounter the Tao Te Ching as a book about peace, about letting go, about not trying. And in one sense, that reading is correct. But it is incomplete. Because what Lao Tzu was describing beneath the poetry and the paradox was a theory of causation, a radical claim about how change actually happens in the world. His central concept, Wu Wei, is usually translated as non-action or effortless action. But neither translation fully captures what he meant. Wu Wei is not laziness. It is not disengagement. It is the art of aligning oneself so precisely with the natural movement of events that one's own effort becomes almost invisible and therefore almost unstoppable. Water, Lao Tzu wrote, is the softest substance in the world. It yields to everything. It flows around rocks, fills the lowest places, never fights. And yet, given enough time, water carves canyons out of solid granite. It does not force. It does not hurry. And nothing can stop it. This is not a metaphor for passivity. It is a blueprint for a particular kind of power, the kind that does not announce itself, does not exhaust itself, and does not break against resistance. It simply continues, and in continuing, it transforms everything it touches. The question, of course, is what this looks like in practice. In 217 BCE, a Roman army under the consul Gaius Flaminius marched confidently along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene in central Italy. Flaminius was an aggressive commander, popular with his troops, and deeply impatient with caution. He had been warned. His scouts had told him the terrain ahead was dangerous, that the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca had been seen moving forces into the hills above the lake road. Flaminius dismissed the warnings. He had an army of perhaps 30,000 men. He was in a hurry. Hannibal had been waiting. He had positioned his forces, cavalry, heavy infantry, light skirmishers, in the fog-covered hills surrounding the road, hidden, silent, utterly still. He had been waiting not for hours, but for days. He had studied Flaminius. He knew the man's temperament, his need for speed, his contempt for caution, and he had built a trap not out of force, but out of patience, out of the willingness to wait until the precise moment when action would cost him almost nothing and yield him everything. When the Roman army entered the narrow corridor between the lake and the hills, Hannibal gave the signal. Within 3 hours, approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead. It was one of the most complete military ambushes in recorded history, and it was won almost entirely in the waiting, in the hours and days before a single weapon was raised. Hannibal did not win at Lake Trasimene because he was stronger than Flaminius. He won because he understood something that Flaminius could not bring himself to accept, that the right moment, patiently identified and quietly held, is worth more than any advantage of numbers or speed. This principle appears again and again throughout history, in contexts far removed from the battlefield. In the early 1940s, a young chemist named Dorothy Hodgkin was working in a laboratory at Oxford University, trying to determine the molecular structure of penicillin. The problem was extraordinarily difficult. X-ray crystallography, the technique she was using, required enormous patience, not the patience of waiting for results, but the patience of working with incomplete data, of holding uncertainty without collapsing into premature conclusions. Her colleagues, under pressure to publish, were tempted to fill in the gaps, to guess, to force the data into a structure that seemed plausible. Hodgkin refused. She waited for more evidence. She held the ambiguity. In 1945, she published the correct structure of penicillin, a finding that would eventually contribute to her Nobel Prize in Chemistry, awarded in 1964. Her patience was not a character trait. It was a scientific method. It was a refusal to let the desire for answers distort the process of finding them. There is something in this that most modern frameworks of productivity and success simply do not accommodate. We are living in a cultural moment that is deeply, almost pathologically hostile to waiting. The tools we use, the platforms we inhabit, the metrics we optimize for, all of them reward speed. All of them treat delay as failure. A message that goes unanswered for more than a few hours is an insult. A project that takes longer than expected is a problem. A career that develops slowly is somehow less admirable than one that erupts overnight. And yet the historical record does not support this bias toward speed. The historical record, examined honestly, tells a different story. It tells the story of a Japanese swordsmith working in the Kamakura period, sometime in the late 13th century. His name, according to tradition, was Masamune, and he is considered by many historians of metallurgy to be the greatest swordsmith who ever lived. The blades he produced, the few that survive, are held in museums and private collections and treated as national treasures of Japan. What made them extraordinary was not a secret technique, not a proprietary alloy, not some innovation that others lacked the intelligence to discover. It was time. Masamune folded his steel thousands of times. He heated and cooled and hammered with a patience that his contemporaries found almost incomprehensible. He was not trying to finish. He was trying to find the moment, in the metal, in the fire, in the process itself, when the blade would tell him it was ready. His contemporary, a swordsmith named Muramasa, was by most accounts equally skilled in raw technique. But Muramasa was impatient. His blades were sharper in one sense, more aggressive, quicker to cut, but they were also more brittle. They broke under stress in ways that Masamune's blades never did. The comparison became legendary in Japan, so much so that it filtered into folklore. Masamune's swords were said to bring peace, while Muramasa's were said to bring violence. The metaphor, accurate or not, has endured for 7 centuries, and at its core is a very simple observation about what patience, applied to a craft, actually produces. There is a temptation when telling stories like these to romanticize the waiting, to make it sound clean and noble and even pleasant. But that would be dishonest. Strategic patience is not comfortable. It is not the peaceful feeling of a man sitting by a river watching the water. It is, in most cases, actively difficult. It requires holding tension without releasing it prematurely. It requires tolerating uncertainty when every instinct is screaming for resolution. It requires watching opportunities that might be real or might not pass without acting on them, because the timing is wrong, because the moment has not yet fully arrived. In the autumn of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. He believed in it. He had been moving toward it for months, and yet he waited. His Secretary of State, William Seward, had told him that issuing the proclamation while the Union armies were struggling would look like desperation, like a last resort, a cry for help dressed up as a moral declaration. It would be dismissed. It would be weak. Lincoln put the document in a drawer. He waited for a Union victory. He waited through weeks of military setback and political pressure and personal anguish. And then, after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, a brutal, costly, inconclusive battle that was nonetheless declared a Union victory, he issued the proclamation. The timing transformed its meaning. What had been a political measure became a moral turning point, not because the words changed, because the moment changed. And Lincoln had been patient enough to find it. This is the quality that separates strategic patience from ordinary waiting. Ordinary waiting is passive. It is what happens when we have no choice, when we are simply subject to circumstances we cannot influence. Strategic patience is something else entirely. It is active. It requires continuous observation, continuous assessment, continuous readiness to move the instant the conditions are right. The person practicing strategic patience is not resting. They are watching. They are preparing. They are holding themselves in a state of readiness that looks, from the outside, very much like stillness. but is, on the inside, a form of intense and disciplined engagement with reality. The ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, writing in the 5th century BCE, possibly a contemporary of Lao Tzu, possibly not, the historical record is genuinely uncertain, described this quality in terms that remain startling for their precision. The supreme art of war, he wrote, is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is not a recommendation for passivity. It is a recommendation for a kind of mastery so complete that conflict itself becomes unnecessary, because the strategic patience of one party has so thoroughly shaped the conditions that the outcome is already determined before the first move is made. Most people read Sun Tzu and focus on the tactics, the flanking maneuvers, the use of terrain, the management of supply lines. But the deeper argument of the art of war is about time, about the willingness to invest time as a resource, to spend it deliberately, to resist the pressure to act before the conditions support action. The general who wins, Sun Tzu argued, wins before the battle is fought. The general who loses goes into battle first and hopes to win. That sentence, short as it is, contains a complete philosophy of strategic patience. And yet we keep choosing the second path. We keep going into the battle first and hoping to win. We keep launching the project before it is ready, the relationship before it is grounded, the conversation before we have fully understood what we are trying to say. We keep confusing movement with progress, activity with effectiveness, visible effort with actual impact, and the results, so often, reflect that confusion. There is a concept in ecology called succession, the process by which a bare, disturbed piece of land gradually becomes a mature forest. It begins with pioneer species, fast-growing, hardy, opportunistic plants that colonize quickly. They stabilize the soil, create shade, begin the accumulation of organic matter. And then, over decades, they are replaced by slower-growing species, trees that would never have survived on bare ground, but can now take root in the conditions the pioneers created. The mature forest that eventually emerges is not the product of the fastest or most aggressive growth. It is the product of a sequence, each stage creating the conditions for the next, each species playing its role in a process that no single organism controls or hurries. Human endeavors, at their most successful, often follow a similar pattern. The visible achievements, the book, the company, the social movement, are almost always the product of a long preceding period of quiet preparation, relationships built slowly, skills developed without urgency, ideas tested in private before they are committed to in public. The part that the world celebrates is almost always the smallest part. The part that made it possible is almost always invisible. This is not an argument for inaction. It is not a suggestion that effort is worthless, that ambition is misguided, that we should simply wait and trust that things will unfold as they should. That reading would be a distortion of everything that Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, Lincoln, Hodgkin, and Masamune actually demonstrate. Every one of them worked. Every one of them prepared. Every one of them brought enormous skill and commitment to what they did. The difference was not between working and not working. The difference was in how they related to time, specifically in whether they allowed the pressure of urgency to override the discipline of timing. There is a distinction that the philosopher and writer Alan Watts, drawing on Taoist sources, described as the difference between trusting the process and forcing the process. Forcing the process, he argued, is not a sign of commitment. It is a sign of anxiety, of a mind that cannot tolerate the uncertainty of not yet knowing how things will turn out, and so accelerates into action as a way of managing that discomfort. Trusting the process, by contrast, requires a particular kind of courage. The courage to remain engaged and prepared while accepting that the timing of outcomes is not entirely within one's control. This is what strategic patience actually demands. Not the absence of desire, not the suppression of ambition, but the willingness to hold both, to want something deeply while remaining genuinely open to the timing by which it arrives. The person who has learned this does not look, from the outside, like someone with a strategy. They look calm. They look unhurried. They look, to those who have not learned it, like someone who is not trying hard enough. And in a culture that has made visible effort into a moral virtue, that treats busyness as evidence of importance and speed as evidence of seriousness, this appearance can be genuinely difficult to maintain. The social pressure to do something, to show something, to demonstrate motion is enormous, and it falls most heavily on precisely those moments when the most important thing to do is wait. Lincoln felt it. In the months before the Emancipation Proclamation, the pressure from abolitionists, from within his own party, from the newspapers, was relentless. Move faster. Act now. Show the country where you stand. He felt the pressure and he held his position, not because he was indifferent to the cause, but because he understood that the cause would be better served by the right moment than by the right sentiment expressed at the wrong time. Hodgkin felt it. In the competitive world of mid-20th century chemistry, the pressure to publish was constant. Her patience was not the absence of ambition. It was the expression of a more precise ambition, not just to be first, but to be right. And Masamune, if the stories are to be believed, felt it in the forge itself. The pressure of a craft tradition that valued output, that measured a swordsmith partly by the number of blades produced. He chose depth over volume, and the blades he produced have lasted 7 centuries, while the names of faster, more prolific smiths have largely faded. None of this is easy to apply. The moment when it would be most useful to practice strategic patience is almost always the moment when it is most difficult, when the pressure is highest, when the stakes feel most urgent, when every instinct is urging movement. This is why patience is so rarely described as a strategy, even though that is precisely what it is, because strategies are supposed to be deliberately chosen, and in the grip of urgency, deliberate choice is exactly what becomes hardest to access. What the historical record suggests, however, is that the capacity for strategic patience can be developed. It is not simply a gift that some people have and others don't. It is something closer to a skill, one that requires practice, that is built through repeated experience of choosing timing over urgency and observing the results, that deepens over time in ways that raw willpower and raw intelligence do not. The Taoists had a word for the person who had developed this capacity. They called him the sage, not a saint, not an ascetic, not someone who had withdrawn from the world, a person who moved through the world with a quality of presence that was both fully engaged and completely unrushed, who acted when action was required and waited when waiting was required, and who had developed, through long practice, the ability to tell the difference. That ability, to tell the difference, may be the most valuable thing a person can cultivate. Not intelligence, not willpower, not ambition. The ability to stand at the edge of a situation, to feel the pull of urgency, and to ask honestly, is this the moment? And to sit with that question long enough to find a real answer rather than the answer that relieves the discomfort of not knowing. The water does not hurry. It does not need to. It already knows where it is going, and it knows that time is on its side. not because it is passive, but because it has understood something about the nature of force that most things, in their urgency, have not. That understanding is available. It has always been available. History has been showing it to us for 25 centuries in the decisions of generals and scientists and craftsmen and leaders who learned, each in their own way, that the most powerful thing they could do, at the exact moment when everything in them was screaming to act, was to wait, to watch, to prepare, and to trust that the moment, when it came, would be unmistakable,